Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gamesta here. Today we're looking at the heroic Megaera fight on Throne of Thunder, or in Throne of Thunder even. And this fight is a fair difficulty jump from normal. The main challenge is, in addition to everything being boosted in damage on heroic of course, there's also the addition of one new head type, which is the Arcane head. We'll talk about its specific abilities in a moment. But now you have 4 different heads, the green, blue, fire, and purple, or arcane. The other main challenge in this encounter on heroic is that because the abilities all ramp up, of course, your strategy is almost invariably locked into one specific head order that is considered the standard. You can't really deviate from this because of the way the green head handles the poison bolts, basically. And I'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. The only real option you have in terms of strategy change is basically the tanks and therefore the positioning that you use throughout the raid. And so I'll mention a few different strategies that you can use to handle this, and of course talk about the one that we end up settling on that you see here in the video. So let's just get started talking about the purple head. So the addition of the Arcane or purple head on heroic acts very similar to the other heads throughout the fight. So just like normal, you will only have to deal with 2 heads at any given time. But of course, with the addition of a purple head, it changes the order and dynamics a little bit. So you'll get purple as your 4th head all the way in the left cubby, which normally is empty throughout the normal difficulty. And this head has normal melee attacks if you get in melee range, a breath attack, which deals the standard 165,000 damage per tick. As a quick aside, though, we found from logs something that was quite interesting, that the breath attacks last for 3 seconds and are supposed to deal damage every second, but the green, blue, and purple heads actually do 4 ticks over 3 seconds, so slightly faster than once a second. The red head, however, behaves itself and does 3 ticks over 3 seconds. So just keep that in mind. It's a slight bit more spike damage on your tanks from the non-red heads when they're breathing. Anyway, so the purple head's breath, in addition to the damage, the stacking debuff that it does is called diffusion. And this basically reduces healing on the tank by 10% per stack, but this healing is then redistributed to any player within 10 yards of that tank. So you don't lose the effective healing if someone else is within range to take it over. Because it's only 10% per stack, it's almost negligible, and the purple head is one of the easier heads to deal with in combination with anything else. Because of that, it's very minor. The only thing easier is the frost one, of course, which doesn't really do anything extra as long as you don't get frozen. So, the final new addition from the purple head, its special ability used on the raid, is the new ads that you've probably seen swimming around there, the nether worms. So when a nether tear is cast by the arcane head, and this only occurs when it's in the concealing fog, just like the other special abilities, this will spawn a set of 3 nether worms. Now these don't spawn right away, they instead spawn about 2 seconds apart, one at a time. So that alone makes it a little bit annoying to deal with them. But they basically have 2 abilities. They will cast Nether Spike, which is an interruptible nuke that does arcane damage to a random enemy, and they cast very frequently, this ability. And then they also use Suppression much less frequently. This is a channeled ability that lasts 15 seconds and stuns a random player. It does not seem to target tanks, however, but anyone else is valid. And this stun, while it's channeled, can be dispelled with Magic Dispel. So it's sort of, well, if it's not interrupted through normal means, it forces your dispellers or healers to choose between Cinder Dispels and Suppression Dispels. So we'll talk about some of the strategy options for worms in that section. But that's the basics of the purple head. So you have all the other normal stuff from the other heads, plus the addition of the purple, and so combining all those heads together makes things quite a bit chaotic. And yeah. So let's talk about the changes to heroic for the other heads real quick. So, other than purple, the main change on heroic is the amplification of the abilities used by the heads while they're within this concealing fog. So essentially the special abilities. This means Cinders from the red head, the Torrent of Ice from the frozen or blue, and Acid Rain or Acid Bolt from the green head. So the Cinders change is essentially the same as normal. It's applied to a random player, it's dispellable by magic, leaves a pool of fire when they get dispelled. However, in addition, on heroic, while that debuff is active prior to its dispel, it will also drop pools of fire every 3 seconds where that player happens to be standing. So essentially, if you decide to clear ice, for example, by running a Cinders player around for a while, they will invariably be dropping a trail of fire pools behind them, again, once every 3 seconds, so not quite as frequently as they would travel that distance, but still there's going to be a trail of fire where they go. So it's worth keeping that in mind, and we'll talk about how we decided to handle this in the strategy section. The change to Torrent of Ice from the Frozen is, again, similar to normal. It will target a random player, preferably ranged, and chase them for about 8 seconds. Once the beam is complete, you can see the stuff on the ground looks about the same as normal. However, on Heroic, the actual ground effect, the icy ground, will expand in size over the course of 60 seconds. This will eventually be twice the width, essentially, of the normal size that you would see. So, each icy ground effect takes up a larger and larger portion of the room over that 1 minute period until it reaches its double size maximum. This means, of course, that you have a lot less room to deal with these abilities, and this, of course, is really important if your DPS is low and yada yada. We'll get into that later. And then finally, the Acid Rain or Acid Bolt from the green head is essentially the same, except instead of one bolt at a time, you get 3 at a time. And for this reason alone, it's very, very uncommon. I certainly couldn't find an example of it, where a raid will elect to kill the green head at any point in the fight. Simply because the bolts are cast in random locations. If you happen to get a set of 3 that are cast somewhere where you are unable to avoid 2 of them, you'll probably die without some form of cooldown. Since the damage from even 1 bolt, if you move away from it, is fairly high, getting hit by 3 simultaneously is dreadful. So we didn't try that, and I don't have any footage of it, but that's basically the idea behind the green. So if you have that, you have to come up with a strategy that allows you to force the bolts to be in a specific location. So this would be a good method if you have few or no melee DPS, and you can stack up your ranged in some location and then move when the bolts are about to hit. But again, the frequency of them, the chaos of the other abilities, I don't know if it would work, but that's the basic idea. So just keep that in mind about the green bolts. You won't see them here, but they cast in triplets instead of singles. So the first basic strategy you could implement would be the most familiar to your normal strategy, probably. And this is essentially using 2 standard tanks, 1 for each head. And these, of course, these tanks will alternate heads every round so that the breath stacks never get high. And pretty easy stuff. And then to handle the nether worms, you use a completely separate third individual who will gather them up, quickly get threat on them when they spawn, and then try to DPS them down while doing their best to interrupt, CC, or otherwise incapacitate the worms so that they don't cast very frequently. Now, the usual method for doing this sort of strategy would be sort of a plate DPS player to handle the worms. So DPS Death Knight, perhaps a warrior. You could probably use a Demonology Warlock, I imagine, with some of the tank abilities they have. Although I haven't tried it, of course, but I don't see why mechanically it wouldn't work. But essentially something like that, where you have one player to pick up the worms, AE them down, while doing their best to CC or otherwise stop the casts of those worms. Now the advantages to this method would be simply that your tanks would take very little damage, so healing them is quite easy. Healing the raid is therefore invariably easy. The worms can be positioned wherever you'd like throughout any part of the phase, so that you can easily CC them however you desire. Worms can be CC'd by any form of CC that works on elementals, so you can, crowd control them, or you can stun them, you can silence them somewhat. Be warned that silence effects, disorients, stuff like that, tends to be ignored when the worms are casting their nuke ability. So you can stop them from casting their stun, but they tend to nuke even if they're disoriented and stuff like that. Anyway, so keep that in mind. If you stun them, though, they can't do anything. So stuns are the best thing you can do if you can't actually hard CC them. Anyway, so the disadvantages to this method is that it's going to cost you quite a bit of DPS. Basically, if you're going to have at least one dedicated DPS player to handle worms in this setup. You can sort of have that DPS player, perform dual roles. So a cleave-based DPS, again, like a plate DPS, can still do damage to the head that you're attacking while they're dealing with worms. But the amount of damage is not going to be that significant. If you want to kill worms in a reasonable amount of time, especially as they spawn later on, most of your focus will have to be directly on those worms. And this means that it takes a little bit longer to kill the head that you're attacking, which invariably means more special abilities and potentially more spawns of worms in the first place. So a lot of your strategy decision on this fight will revolve around the idea of whether you want to kill the head that you're on a little bit faster to get slightly fewer special moves and therefore make things a little bit easier in theory. Or if you want to deal with the worms, in a more steady fashion, in a safer way, but then actually have more sets of them, more frost, more cinders, all that stuff. All right, so the second strategy, basically just going down the list from the most basic setup, is to use 2 tanks. So this is just like the previous method. Obviously, again, you have 1 tank on each head, and they alternate every round. So again, your damage from the actual heads will be fairly low, but you don't have a designated DPS player to handle worms. Instead, you get worms on one of your tanks. And that tank, in addition to handling the head that they're on, will also be in charge of doing the primary source of damage to the worms. This is one of the most, if not the most common strategies that you'll find for this fight, and with good reason. A tank that is tanking one of the heads is going to have very high vengeance, so their DPS on AE damage to the worms is going to be quite significant. They will be able to kill them very fast. The downside to this method is essentially a matter of positioning and threat. So you have to have a reliable way to actually get the worms onto the tank and in position in a timely fashion. If they spawn and the tank doesn't have threat, they're going to just fly around to random players, nuke everybody while they're channeling stuns here and there and everywhere, and it just becomes a disaster very quickly. So one thing you can do is if you have a tank that has some form of ranged threat that they can use frequently, such as a monk with their cake throw, that works very well. But because the worms spawn one at a time every 2 or 3 seconds, this has to be pretty much spammed to actually pick them up. And in addition to that, because of the positions that the worms spawn in, sometimes that tank that you've assigned, no matter which round it is, will almost invariably be out of range of their ranged attack, whatever it might be, death and decay or cake throw or something, and they can't pick up the new worms. So if you use this method, you're probably going to need some form of misdirect or tricks or something like that. And really, a hunter misdirect or 2 would be invaluable for this strategy. We did it for quite a while with this setup with just a rogue for tricks, and that works just fine. It's just that the frequency of the worms later on in the fight become faster than a single tricks or misdirect cooldown. I assume they're the same, I'm not sure. But generally faster than a tricks cooldown comes up. So you have to, again, find ways to deal with this. So in our case, when the second round of worms would come up that were faster than the tricks cooldown, what we actually did was have another player, usually me in this case, grab the second set of worms, AE them a little bit to get threat, and then stand on top of our monk tank statue. Then he would taunt off the statue, of course getting him threat, and the worms would come over to him. So this method can be very chaotic if you don't have a very reliable system to getting the worms onto the tank. Once they're on the tank, the basic idea is, again, DPSing them down with the tank only. You can, of course, have ranged DPS or melee if they go between breaths. They can help out with the worm damage if you want, but this gets into the previous strategy a little bit, where you're sort of deciding to not attack the head a little bit in favor of killing the worms slightly faster. And generally speaking, if you're using this 2-tank method, you probably want to focus most of your damage on the head, and then just prevent the casts of the worms wherever possible. If you do elect to do a 2-tank method where one of the tanks is on the worms, a monk tank handling the worms is really, really good. We didn't really try with other tanks. We only have a paladin as our other tank. And, so again, I can't say what the advantages of those tanks might be. But the advantage to a monk tank is essentially the ability to use Breath of Fire, when glyphed, to disorient the worms and stop them from channeling their stun casts. And so in addition to doing solid DPS with Breath of Fire, the monk tank can, of course, throw their keg to get threat. So you can see the worms coming over to the bottom right on our monk tank there. And then he can Breath of Fire them fairly frequently, every 2 chi, to interrupt them. Now, of course, you have to be careful that you don't run out of enough chi to keep your shuffle maintained and all that. But I would also say that shuffles may not be always 100% necessary in this situation if you have a form of cooldown during the breath periods from the heads. So basically, communication is the name of the game here. If with good cooldown rotations and knowing when that tank needs to be spike healed and all that stuff, you can probably afford to have them focus more on DPS and interrupts on the worms than necessarily their damage reduction from the head. But you'll have to just test that out for yourself. But the bottom line here is, if you try this method and you have a monk tank, have that player handle the worms. It's going to be much easier than probably most of the other tanks because of those reasons. So finally, a tip that relates to this 2-tank strategy, as well as the next strategy I'll talk about, which is the one we actually use, is the idea that you don't necessarily have to be forced to keep a player, usually a tank, within melee range of the heads at all times when you're not in Rampage. So essentially what happens here is, if you're not in Rampage and there's no player within melee range of a head, it will cast Megaera's Rage. This ability is a 2.5 second cast, and it's just chain cast over and over and over until someone gets in melee range. This does about 325,000 damage. The damage type is based on the head, so purple head does Arcane, green does Nature, and so on. And it does this damage to the targeted player, plus anyone within 5 yards, so a small AE. However, if you have good reason for not having someone within melee range at a particular time, you can take advantage of this fact and modify your strategy to make things a lot easier for yourself. So for the 2-tank method, where one of your tanks is handling worms, this can commonly be used between breath timings for your worm tank to separate away from the head that they're tanking momentarily to move into melee range of the worms that they need to pick up at the moment, and then move back into range of the head before the next breath, so they can position it wherever the breath is not going to hit the raid. So again, I don't have footage of that specific tactic being implemented, but the strategy or the explanation is pretty simple. So in this setup here on, say, green and blue, if you didn't have any melee DPS or people within melee range other than your tank that were on the green head, then your green head tank, if they were the worm tank, could essentially wait for breath and then move out of melee range, that green head would start casting Megaera's Rage on random players every 2.5 seconds, which is not a huge amount of damage. It's just spike damage that you have to be careful of. But, you could compare it to melee damage on the tank. Anyway, during that period, then that tank could pick up worms that might have spawned recently that are running around or whatever. And as long as the tank moved back into position on the green head before the next breath and faced it away, you wouldn't lose anything, essentially. And this allows you to handle the worms in a much simpler fashion. Now, obviously, things get a lot more complicated if you have melee DPS, and that tank happens to be tanking the head that you want to damage at the time. So here, we killed the blue head there, so if we were alternating tanks like you would in a 2-tank method, the green head tank from previously would now be on this red head that we're attacking. So any melee DPS would have to run away if the tank also ran away to get adds or something. So if you, again, use that method where your tank runs out briefly to pick up adds or something, make sure your melee either don't exist, you have all range DPS, or they aren't in range of that head that you're attacking. So the third strategy, which is the one you see in the video here that we ultimately settled on as the most efficient and effective, is to use one tank on the heads at all times pretty much, and then one tank that's separate from the heads to deal with the worms. Now, there are a couple very strong advantages to this method, and then a lot of sort of gimmicky disadvantages as well. So again, we ultimately found that this was the best method, at least for our raid, but you'll have to decide for your own, of course, whether this works for you or not. The basic advantage here, the most clear advantage, is that you have very strong control over the worms. And in my opinion, at least, management of the worms is really the key to getting this fight down on heroic. You'll be somewhat used to handling the other effects and all that stuff, and you'll have basic strategies worked out for those pretty quickly. But the worms being the new thing really need to be managed in an effective way. So having a dedicated player, usually a tank, that can focus solely on worms, they can pick them up at any time, in any position, move them wherever they please at any moment, that becomes very effective and efficient. So, with that said, the other main advantage is much higher DPS overall to targets that matter. So if you consider, say, both your tanks do, just for simple calculation, 100,000 DPS while they're each tanking one of the heads, and then when one tank has worms as well, if you're using strategy 2, you add another 20% damage or something. Well, that 20% extra from the worm tank is being dealt to an effective target, the worms in this case, but the 100k in normal damage that they're doing to their head is lost damage. It doesn't do anything to benefit your raid if that tank is doing damage to a head that you're not trying to kill, right? But in this case, where you have one tank on both heads, and they're always actually in melee range of the one that you're trying to kill, that tank's effective DPS will go up because they're going to take more damage and therefore have higher vengeance. So that tank might do 150,000, for example. These are just made up numbers. So that's 50,000 more effective DPS to the head that you want to kill. In addition to that, your tank that's not on the heads, that just deals with worms, they'll do lower damage, maybe 80,000, but that's all effective DPS because they're going to only be attacking worms that you want to kill or the head that you're on at the time. So right there with your tanks, you gain a significant jump in overall DPS for your raid. You also gain a lot of control on the heads, or excuse me, the worms, as I mentioned. So the combination of those two really, decided the choice for us. Now the disadvantages to this method can be somewhat tricky. The first big disadvantage is because you only have one tank and there are two heads active, this means that except for when you're attacking blue and green simultaneously, you just simply cannot have your tank in melee range of the green head throughout most of the fight. Because of this, that green head will spend most of its time spamming Megaera's Rage, which I mentioned before, which again is about 300,000 damage to a random target and anyone close to them. So it's not a huge amount of increased damage. On average, it's probably going to be lower than the damage that your tank would actually take, because the green head is never killed, so it gains haste stacks, yada, yada, yada. So effectively, you ignore the melee haste benefit that head gains because it's not killed. But this also means that you have to really be careful of positioning around that green head, because if anyone gets in melee range, they're going to get chomped very quickly. So the other issue is that because no one has melee range, your head tank, so here the tank that's on the red head, he's going to be targeted by the green head for breath attacks. So just like your normal breath attacks, these occur in a cone, and you have to be very aware and careful of your positioning, especially of your melee DPS players, so that they do not get affected by the breath when it casts from the green head. So this essentially comes down to very precise positioning of your tank and your melee, and then of course other raid members not crossing over those safety lines or barriers. So one of the key things to managing a one-tank method is your positions for your tank that's on the arcane heads and your melee DPS throughout most of the fight. So if you look around the room as the video goes on, you can see we use all 5 raid markers for very specific positions and purposes. So as I describe these, then you can actually look in the video and sort of see them in action and approximately where we put them. So here is a top-down view of the battlefield, and try not to be too impressed with the amazing artistic quality of it. Thank you very much. But this is essentially showing where all the heads will spawn, green on the right, then blue next to it, then red to the left of that, and then purple all the way over. And then the raid markers are the squares, the 5 squares, that correspond where you'll see them in the actual in-game footage, approximately. The circles around the purple and the green head represent the approximate melee range of those heads. And then finally, the cone going from the green head represents the breath attack cone size that would affect anyone that's within that cone. So it's, of course, always going to be aiming directly at the tank. So in this simulation shot, even though all heads are theoretically up, this top-down view, imagine that we're attacking purple and green at the time. So what this means is that our tank's position, he essentially wants to be as far at the top, if you're looking down at it, if you pretend that the top is north, even though I don't think it really is in the game, but basically as far up as possible the tank wants to be positioned, and then as far to the right toward the green head as possible. So this essentially puts his position in this case at the green square marker that you see on the image there. By doing this, he's as far away from the purple head without getting out of melee range, and as close to the top right near the green head as you can get, even though you're far across the room. By doing this slightly moves the cone and where it's aimed from the breath attack from green, such that your melee DPS, who are positioned at the purple square marker at the bottom, at max melee range, can avoid that breath attack. And that's essentially the idea of all positions. You need to use a marker or some other designation that your melee DPS can be aware of to know where they can stand safely. Your tank also needs to know where they need to stand for any given head combination. And then the distance between those two and the angle that the distance creates relative to the angle of the breath from green will not cross over each other. So melee DPS won't get hit by breath. So while I don't have it, shown here in this picture exactly, if you imagine, that we're attacking the red head, for example, then the melee DPS position is at the red square marker on the image there. And then our tank would essentially be doing the same basic method that he did for the purple. So he would be with his back toward the blue circle where the blue head would spawn, up against the water's edge there, as far to the right and as far up or atop as he can get. Again, this closes the gap between himself and green as much as he can, and then allowing the melee DPS to, have maximum range essentially. So that's the basic idea for positions for your tank and your melee DPS with this method. Now, the one final thing you can consider as we go back to the video here is whether you want your tank to directly tank the green head and the blue head at the same time while those two are active, or stay out of melee range of the green head. Now in our case, with the exception of the very first head combination, when you start off with green and blue, we elected not to have our tank in melee range of green at all. And it seemed pretty obvious why. Because you never attack green in this method, the haste stack that it gains will increase its melee DPS significantly, and the only advantage to being within range of the green head is that you can build a little bit of extra threat during that actual phase while you're not in Rampage, and you'll get slightly higher vengeance, or I shouldn't say slightly, significantly higher vengeance on the tank for more DPS on the blue head that you're attacking at the time. The downside, of course, is that the damage on that tank is going to be really high, and we just found it wasn't, worth it, essentially. So, again, it's up to you. If you are comfortable with the survival for having your tank in melee range of the blue and the green at the same time, then your melee DPS don't have to be quite as careful of their position on that combination, and don't have to worry about getting in melee range of green accidentally, especially when they're running with cinders or something. But obviously you'll have to do a lot more healing on the tank at that time. So to maintain threat on the green head for your head tank throughout the fight, you have to have some sort of method in play. Now, one thing you can do is to basically stand kind of where I am actually right now, but a little bit up and to the right up against that little mound there of dirt between the blue and the green. And your head tank can cleave both heads at the start of the fight, and by standing right in the between them, the breaths will cross over each other and not hit any of your melee that are at max range. So of course you're going to get smacked in the back at the same time by the green, and you can do some cleave damage and stuff and whatever you want, and then you can build threat that way. That's fine. But what we found actually worked best for us, as you see here, was to have our Wyrm tank, our monk in this case, pick up the green initially, and for that first round, he would tank it along with the single set of worms that you'll get. And then once the Rampage begins, our Paladin tank during Rampage runs over to the green, so you can see him very far on the right there, attacking the green. So he taunts it, essentially taking over that base threat level that our monk tank built up on the green, does some more damage to it during Rampage, and then just comes back into range of the red before Rampage ends. So now he's in position, and he's taken over that large threat boost that the monk initially built on the green head. From this point forward, for about half the Rampages essentially, our Paladin tank, or a little over half actually, he will go over to the green and attack it during the Rampage to maintain his threat lead, and then get back in position wherever he needs to be after Rampage is about to end. So it's a pretty simple rule, and it worked out quite well. Now, the only time that our Paladin tank does not go over to the green is during the Rampage that precedes the purple head, so the one you're seeing right here actually. So if you look closely, you'll see that our Paladin tank stays in melee range and clumped up with the group. The main reason for this is that this follows the red head, and therefore he has Ignite on him. And if he goes over to the green right now, he's going to be out of melee range or close to it, but yeah, more importantly, it's just really hard to heal him when he's not clumped up with the AE heals that are going on, and he has 3 stacks of Ignite, for example, or even 2. So we found, at least on that particular set, the Rampage, where you're stacked up near purple, to essentially keep your tank near you and not worry about threat there. He can do it during the other 2 rampages just fine and maintain his threat lead. So that's the basic tip that we have for that. If you're using a second tank to actually handle the worms, then you can have that tank on green first and just have your primary head tank take over after that first round ends. So dealing with various combos of the heads for your tank can lead to significant high spike damage depending on which heads you have active. By far the most dangerous is the red and green combination, simply because Ignite is a huge amount of extra damage and it lasts a long time, in addition to, of course, doing more damage per stack. The blue head is the least dangerous by far. There's no extra damage boost or anything, and obviously you just can't allow yourself to get to enough stacks to be stunned, but that shouldn't be a problem. And then purple is, fairly easy, but in between them, essentially. So the best thing you can do to handle survival for your tank is a tank rotation cooldown for breaths. Obviously, double breaths on one player is a lot of damage per second, and they're going to come not quite at the exact same time, but pretty close together. So essentially over 4 to 6 seconds, that tank will be taking 2 breaths simultaneously, as well as a couple miscellaneous melee hits in there. So what you need to do is cool down every breath combination in some way. Obviously, this depends on your tank class, actually, what you're using. For us, we had a paladin tank, so the basic rotation was he would hand a purity, the first breath of any round, just for the 10% innate reduction. It's got a short cooldown, so that's fine. The second breath, he would use divine protection for the magic damage reduction on the breath. And then the third one, he would use a big cooldown. So one of his 3 minutes, like Gak or Ardent Defender. Usually these would be up, at least later in the fight, for every other head round. But it's not always the case. It depends on your DPS. So early on, you may find that the rounds of the heads are around a minute. So obviously, every third head is not going to be 3 minutes apart for those cooldowns. So just be ready for that situation and have an outside cooldown available, such as, in our case, Bubble from a mistweaver like myself would sort of fill that gap on that third breath. If you get a fourth breath, then you'd have to change your rotation slightly. So in our case, if we were going to get 4, we would do Purity, Divine Protection, Purity again, because breaths are about 17 seconds apart, and then his big cooldown on the fourth one. But with our DPS, we never ended up getting 4. We'd get 3 or occasionally 2. So again, just figure it out yourself. Before you actually even start pulling, you can pretty easily estimate what your rotation will be and then go from there. We also have a druid healer, so she could use Iron Bark on the tank. So she would generally do that on the second breath pair. Since that's a minute cooldown, you can basically use it every round, and it's pretty easy. As I said, the biggest danger is the combination of red plus green, and so that's the one you really have to be careful of and make sure you use all your big cooldowns. So most of the time, I would use my bubble on the third breath of red and green, and even with combination of another cooldown if necessary. So dealing with Cinders, there's a couple ways you can do it, but the way that seems easiest by far that we settled on is similar to the normal method. Essentially, you dispel it as fast as possible. That's pretty much it. So if it hits a ranged player, someone that's at range, not in melee anywhere, you just dispel it immediately. And the thinking here is pretty obvious. If you leave it on them for at least 3 seconds or more, then they're just going to start dropping pulls anyway, and that just takes up unnecessary space in the room. Now you can, of course, use Cinders to extinguish the ice trails on the ground if you want to, but because you're leaving a cinder pool every 3 seconds while you run, the only way that this is an actual gain is if you run fast enough and efficiently enough to have the spread of your cinders be far enough apart that you can fit through the gaps that you're leaving behind you in the trail. And this would, in theory, allow players with future frost beams to weave in sort of a zigzag pattern between the cinders that were left in a straight line and extinguish those cinders and then basically cross over the same area with the frost. Now that's a very convoluted, complex method, but it works. The problem is it takes a lot of time and, more importantly, a lot of healing that you're probably going to want to devote elsewhere, especially if you decide to do a one tank method like we're doing here. So I would suggest just instantly dispelling cinders, and then your main focus for your non-tank players, or at least your ranged and your healers, will be dealing with the frost throughout the fight. So Torrent of Ice, depending on how many ranged DPS and healers that are affected by it that you have in your raid, can be a real pain in the ass. And props go out to our paladin, druid healer, and our 2 ranged DPS in this fight. They just spent a lot of time running around, essentially, because Torrent of Ice becomes very, very frequent as the fight progresses, and you kill more of the frost heads, of course. But essentially, it works the same mechanically as it does in normal, chasing one player after a short 2 or 3 second activation period and leaving a trail in whatever path that they run. So the problem is, because it expands in heroic, you are limited in the amount of space you can use to leave the trails. So the basic strategy that we came up with that worked well was when you get targeted by frost, you essentially run backward toward the back of the room in a straight line, because if you run side to side, you're going to limit the space that ranged players have to stand safely between the melee position, the safe breath area, and the being out of range position, essentially. If you're too far back, you won't be in heal range or DPS range even. So running side to side is generally bad for the ice. So to help maximize space, in addition to running just in a straight line, you also want to run as close to existing frost lines as possible. So you can see, if you look in the bottom right, our healers and our ranged are almost in a perfect conga line there, very efficient, so that when one of them gets targeted, they can run along the existing trail straight back and maximize that use of space. If you aren't very efficient in how you position these, you'll quickly run out of room, especially in combination with cinders on your ranged players. So you need to find an efficient way to do this. The easiest thing that we found was that, based on the duration of existing patches on the ground, we essentially would force the one set of ice patches to the right side of the room, and then the next head round, we would then move to the opposite side of the room on the left and force the patches there. And then usually by the time we went back to the other side for the next head, the ones that we placed down on the right would be disappearing, and we could use the right side again, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, this depends, again, on your DPS and all that good stuff. But for the most part, that was the basic rule. Another thing that some of our players found, especially if they have movement boost effects, is that they could, in theory, run through the ice patch for a tick or two to basically get to the other side of a patch. So if I was a valid target, for example, and I got patched here, if I couldn't run backwards, I could essentially go right through the ice patch that exists there on the right of me, and then run it on the right quadrant there, that opening gap. But you'd have to just on the fly decide if that's something you can do or not. Obviously, stuff that increases your movement or just teleports you a short distance, like roll or blink, disengage, stuff like that is very useful in this situation. Anyway, but the basic idea that we found was to every round just alternate the side that you're on, positioning the ice as close to one side as possible, and then hugging existing ice where you can. And then eventually they'll fade when you come back to that side the next round. Another tactic I've seen used a lot in videos, we just couldn't try it obviously because of our raid comp, is to utilize warlock portals for handling ice. You can do it, kind of one of two ways. Either to enter the portal initially when you get ice, although that can be tricky if you're not quick, because you don't want the ice to cover the entrance area and therefore not be reachable by future players. Or you can use the portal to just get back into the fight after running an ice away. However, if you can do it for the initial cast, then you can basically force the ice to follow the same trail over and over and over, and stack up a lot of ice patches on top of each other, which will of course save tons of space in the room. But either way, warlock portals are really good for this fight. So if you have one, take advantage of it. It'll just help you in your overall DPS, your overall healing, and of course your positioning of the ice as well. So lastly, I want to talk about the best time to use your DPS burn cooldowns, the bloodlust, things like that, based purely on which head is the most dangerous or has the most potential to ruin your day, and therefore you want it to die fastest, as well as when you might want to elect for DPS players to assist your Wyrm tank, whether it be an actual tank or DPS player, doesn't matter. When you might want to actually focus Wyrms down quickly and efficiently, rather than leaving them up longer because of the danger they present. So early on, I think I mentioned this before, you're going to only have one purple head in the Concealing Fog at the start of the fight. So essentially you get the baseline set of Wyrms. Once every round of specials, you get one new set of Wyrms. So you can see here we got one set of Wyrms on the first head before we killed it. And if it had taken 5 or 10 seconds longer, we would have gotten a second set, but that's just the normal rate. Same thing goes for the red head. So round number 2, you get the base rate of Wyrms. Then the third round, you're on the purple head, so you don't have one in the fog, so you get no Wyrms on that one, so that one's really easy. And then the fourth round, you've now killed one of the purple heads, so you've got 2 of them, so you start to get double sets, basically, or twice as many Wyrms will spawn. So that's when the fight really kicks in. When you're on the blue head, which is the fourth round, the second time, you'll have double sets of Wyrms, and while your tank should be able to pick these up fairly effectively, DPSing them down before the round ends will be very difficult. There's just going to be a lot of them. They spawn one at a time, as I mentioned, pretty much, and effectively it's hard to do solid DPS to all of them at all times. So when you kill that blue head, so you basically in the fourth round and you're getting ready for the fifth round during the Rampage, that is generally when you're going to want to blow your DPS cooldowns. Because that fifth round, you have the red head along with green for your, tanks that are on the heads, whatever it might be. So that's the most dangerous combination there. You also are getting double sets of adds throughout this phase. So the combination of 2, in addition to having a double set of adds already existing going into the Rampage, means that you really want to burn that red head down very quickly on that fifth round. But in addition, you want to kill the Wyrms too. So what we found worked best was to stack up in our normal spot when that fifth round begins, when the Rampage begins for it. So near the red head. And we DPS the adds down right away, allowing our DPS to actually help out with the Wyrms. You can burn them down really quickly if everyone AEs. And then after the Wyrms are dead, we blow Bloodlust during the last half of Rampage, and that way we can get the red head as low as possible before the actual phase begins and get in our normal positions. This then allows us to hopefully push the red head down before we get too many sets of Wyrms and they just overwhelm us. So if I just fast forward briefly, you can see here we're starting the fifth round. We're entering Rampage on the red head. We had a double set of Wyrms that were active, so we made sure those were killed off quickly. And now that we're stacked up and the Wyrms are dead, we Bloodlust, do all our DPS cooldowns, and we're trying to burn this red head as much as possible. So looks like, what do we get it to? 60% or so. So not the greatest burn, but that's fine because we wanted to make sure those worms were dead. Because with a double set of worms entering Rampage, the amount of spike damage on players is very high because those worms will nuke them along with Rampage ticks, and it's just very dangerous. So again, you want to focus those down. Now by doing that, then the redhead should die fairly fast here, and thus you should only get probably 2, maybe 3 sets of worms before the head dies. So here we got 2, and that's because of course we bloodlusted. So now we again DPS the worms down, actually focusing people on that so that they don't kill us in spike damage during Rampage, and then we're on the purple head. So this actually means during this next round we're only going to get the base set of worm adds. So we're not going to get double because one of those purple heads is not in the fog. He's right there. So now this round is actually fairly stable. So this one you sort of save up everything you've got for the final round that you'll get at the end here in a moment. So might as well just walk through this here and we'll just play it out. So there's the first set of worms there. But we're not going to get a second, or I mean, we'll get a second set, but we're not going to get double sets. So if we were in the double, we would have already gotten another set spawning now. But essentially we get to delay that. So we'll still get 2, but we don't have to actually have DPS cooldowns or bloodlust to avoid that second set on this round. Or avoid the third set, rather. I can't speak. So there's the second set just before the phase ends. So even with a little bit of higher DPS, we probably could have avoided that one, which is great. Anyway, so here we're entering the final Rampage. So at this point, it's all just a matter of survival. So blowing any extra survival cooldowns that players have, individual ones, during this round is the best way to do it. And from here, you're actually going to get triple sets of worms. But because this is the final head, it doesn't matter. Basically, it's all about survival and just finishing the head before everyone dies. So for us, it's very chaotic here. You can see that just things go to hell pretty quickly. But again, it doesn't matter. You're going to get tons of adds, but other than your tank, you can basically just ignore them, try to stun them, silence CC, anything you can for as long as possible so that they don't kill people too quickly. And meanwhile, everyone's just focusing on burning that head down because this is the end and, things will just fall into place eventually. So lastly, a tip mostly for healers, but it applies to everyone in the raid, of course, is to have some rotation of cooldowns for rampages. The way we found that worked best to deal with this was we all obviously have a stacking point for every rampage so that, efficient AE heals work better, and of course targeted raid cooldowns can be effective as well. But the basic idea is we assign players to do cooldowns based on the color of the head that we're attacking during that rampage. So that's easy to remember. So, basically we'd have 2 or 3 people that use their raid cooldown on their particular head and then split that up among 10 players. And, you get 2 or 3 people for every, all 3 of the heads for rampage, and you just rotate through it. And that's pretty much the idea. The big rampages that are really dangerous, as I mentioned, are the 5th one, where you're attacking the red. You have all the adds up. 6th one is not a big deal. And then the last one, while you're on blue for the final round, like you see here, can also be damaging. But by then, you should be able to just say personal cooldowns as well as whatever you have left for raid, since you're not going to have another round. So anything you got at that point. And so if you have a good rotation of cooldowns for rampages, then the healing is not too bad on it. We do use 3 healers here. If I didn't mention that, I apologize, because there's a lot of damage going on, especially with one tank method. But yeah, by gaining the extra DPS from a 1 tank, you can basically afford that extra healer, essentially. So here we're just burning them down, and that's pretty much it. So Heroic Megaera is tough, but feels appropriate once you get the adds under control, and then you have a good method for handling either your positions and or your frosts, icy ground stuff, all that, then everything should fall into place. So, as always, good luck. Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed, please subscribe.